I am Avery Thorne, and the air inside the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza was thick with three things: expensive cologne, the smell of old money confidence, and the low-humming tension of a finance aristocracy, saying goodbye to one of its kings. This was my father, Richard Thorne's retirement party, a monument to 40 years spent making decisions that moved markets and shaped careers. He stood on a raised platform, the Boston Harbor lights glittering behind him like scattered diamonds, basking in the applause from 300 of the city's most influential people. I was standing near the back, my champagne flute held tight, already anticipating the script I knew by heart. It was the same one he'd played for 30 years. The success of his son, the stability of his wife, and the mystery of his only daughter. The way he always talked about me, it was as if I were a particularly expensive, but ultimately failed, exotic car in his garage. If you've ever walked into a room full of people who think they know exactly who you are, but they are spectacularly, dramatically wrong, you need to hear the rest of this story. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel, because what my father said next was the hook he needed to get me here, but what happened 5 minutes later was the unhook that set me free. His voice, amplified by the microphone, boomed over the brass band. "And finally," he said, holding up a crystal decanter, his eyes sweeping the crowd with a practiced warmth that never quite reached me. "My children. My son, Brendan, the Rock. He's staying right here at the firm, stepping into the role I was ready to leave behind. He is the future." A roar of applause. Brendan, standing next to him in a bespoke Italian suit, nodded with the practiced humility of a man who'd won a championship he hadn't played in. Then my father's gaze found me across the room. The pause was deliberate, an act of theater designed to draw the entire room's attention. And my daughter, Avery. The shift in tone was instantaneous, from booming pride to a sympathetic, almost pained tenderness. Avery, bless her heart, left the corporate track a few years ago to pursue, to find herself. She had a little startup, he said, the word startup delivered with a surgical precision that made it sound like a child's imaginary friend. But now she's between things, just figuring it all out. We're so proud of her for trying, of course. She's taking a much-needed break. In the high-stakes world of Boston finance, between things, or taking a break, was code for unemployed, a failure, and financially dependent. The implication was clear. The smart, ambitious daughter had stumbled, and only the father's steady hand kept her from falling. I felt the familiar cold burn on my cheeks, not of shame, but of pure, distilled rage. I'd spent 2 years building a company from my tiny North End apartment, working 18-hour days while Brendan was closing deals his secretary set up. I hadn't failed. I'd succeeded beyond anything my father could have engineered. I hadn't come here to cause a scene, only to be present for my mother, but his words were a declaration of war, a public stripping of my dignity. I watched a small cluster of executives from the rival firm Winslow & Green turn to whisper and smirk. My father, always performing, always managing the narrative, had just used my life as a cautionary tale to elevate his own legacy. But I hadn't just arrived with a champagne flute. I had come with a meticulously planned strategy, 2 years in the making, and a contract that was about to flip his entire narrative, and perhaps his entire life, on its head. I looked at the floor, not in surrender, but to check the exact timing on the vibration in my hand. It was 8:47 p.m., 3 minutes early. Across the room I saw her, Ms. Evelyn Reed, the head of global HR for my father's firm, Sterling Capital. She wasn't just walking, she was moving with the precise, deliberate focus of a high-powered executive with a direct objective. She was cutting a straight path toward me, a thin, embossed leather portfolio clutched in her hand. And the smile she gave me was not one of sympathy for an unemployed daughter, but a shared, dangerous understanding. The play was about to begin, and my father had just handed me the lead role. I watched as Ms. Reed's sleek silhouette cut through the mingling guests, her presence demanding silent attention in a way my father's loud declaration never could. The smirk on the face of the Winslow & Green VP, a man named Marcus who had always made me feel invisible, had not yet vanished. It was fixed there, a smug monument to my supposed failure, which was about to be obliterated by 4 words. The air grew electric, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the shadow in the corner. I was the epicenter of the entire room's gravity. I stood straighter, waiting for the inevitable collision of my father's lie and my undeniable truth. Staying there, under the gaze of hundreds of people who had defined my worth based on his words, required a strength that only deep resentment can forge. I remembered every time he had said I was too ambitious or too logical, and I knew this was the night logic would finally beat his ambition. To understand the weight of that moment, the public lie versus the imminent truth, you have to understand the dynamic that ruled the Thorne family for 3 decades. My father, Richard, didn't just love a good narrative. He lived in one. He was the self-made man, the mentor, the legend. Brendan was cast as the heir apparent, the carbon copy who stayed close, played golf at the right clubs, and wore the right watch. He was the safe investment. I, Avery, was the variable, the risk, the daughter who saw the cracks in the foundation. I didn't want the comfortable corner office at Sterling Capital, not after I realized the innovation they celebrated was just meticulously polished conformity. I was the one who, 3 years ago, pointed out a massive compliance gap in their legacy trade platform, a gap that could, and eventually would, expose them to devastating regulatory fines. My father's response was predictable. Avery, you're too intense. You lack the people skills to rise here. Leave the systems to the seasoned professionals. He dismissed my analysis, which was rooted in the very same machine learning protocols I'd developed in my nights and weekends. That dismissal wasn't a rejection. It was a blueprint. I quit Sterling 2 years ago, not to find myself, but to build the solution they refused to acknowledge. I founded Integrity.ai, a boutique compliance technology firm. The kind of firm that exists in the shadows of the big banks, the one that doesn't need a lavish headquarters, just a team of relentless coders and a watertight product. My initial capital came from selling the condo my grandmother left me, a risky surgical move that cut me off from the Thorne safety net. I didn't ask for a dime, a fact that both infuriated and confused my father. In his world, success was measured by who you knew and who sponsored you. My success was measured by the speed and accuracy of my algorithms, a language he refused to learn. While he told his colleagues I was failing, my systems were being adopted by 3 major London hedge funds and 2 Swiss private banks. My company wasn't small, it was discreet. And it was profitable. My mother, a casualty of the family's narrative, always tried to mediate. He just wants you to be safe, Avery. He doesn't understand your tech talk. But I knew it wasn't a lack of understanding. It was a lack of willingness to admit my vision was superior to his. He needed the world to believe Brendan was the golden boy, and for that narrative to hold, the independent daughter had to be seen as the cautionary tale. That lie reached its zenith 6 months ago. Sterling Capital was under immense confidential pressure from the SEC regarding that very compliance gap I had warned them about years prior. The fines would be catastrophic, and worse, my father's carefully managed retirement package, tied to the firm's stability and reputation, was in serious jeopardy. He needed a Hail Mary pass. Brendan, ever the opportunist, suggested they hire a cutting-edge new compliance software provider. He didn't know it, but the provider he casually mentioned was Integrity.ai. My father approved the consultancy without reading the small print, or perhaps without believing the name Avery Thorne associated with the CEO line was anything more than a common coincidence. He was too arrogant to connect the dots. I had them. Not with a threat, but with a highly technical, legally binding contract that paid me handsomely to fix the problem I had initially identified, all while maintaining complete operational independence. I controlled the solution, which meant I controlled the firm's fate. And the one person who knew the full gravity of the situation was Ms. Evelyn Reed. She was the one who initially reached out under extreme secrecy, recognizing that the only way to plug the massive systemic hole was to go outside the old guard. She knew who I was, what I had built, and why I had built it. And now, as my father finished his little speech, branding me the unemployed failure, Evelyn Reed was 3 feet away, holding the document that contained the shocking truth. Her steps were quiet on the thick carpet, but to me they sounded like 1,000 drums announcing the end of my father's reign of dismissiveness. The crowd, having finished their awkward, sympathetic murmurs, began to move on. But Evelyn Reed was not moving on. She was stopping, right in front of me. Her look, when it finally met mine, was not one of pity, but of cold steel and professional admiration, and in that moment, I knew my whole life had been a preparation for this final act of redefinition. The murmur of the crowd was a wave of expensive sound, but as Ms. Evelyn Reed, the head of Global HR, stopped directly in front of me, that wave seemed to pull back, leaving a sudden, chilling silence between us. Her expression was perfectly neutral, the kind of professional mask that betrays nothing, which meant everything. I had to focus to remember the precise choreography we had planned. The moment I had been working toward, not just for 2 years, but for my entire life, was here. My father was still embracing a colleague, his back to me, luxuriating in the sympathy he had engineered for his struggling daughter. Brendan, smugly sipping his scotch, caught my eye from across the room and gave a condescending little head nod, the kind of gesture that said, "It's okay, failure. Your brother will take care of you eventually." That nod was the fuel I needed. I leaned in, my voice barely a whisper, yet holding the force of a tectonic shift. "You're early, Evelyn. Did Marcus Winslow already make a play?" Evelyn Reed's lips twitched slightly, a ghost of a smile. "They tried, Avery. Right after Richard's speech. Classic aggressive move. They offered Sterling Capital a 10% discount on their entire legacy compliance suite, contingent on an exclusive 5-year contract. Marcus is right behind me, waiting for the smoke to clear so he can move in." She didn't need to elaborate. If Winslow and Green, Sterling's bitterest rival, secured that contract, they would not only expose the compliance flaw, but also strategically absorb much of Sterling's corporate talent and client base. Sterling Capital would be crippled, and my father's retirement, which was an 8-figure golden parachute, would become a liability settlement. This wasn't about a simple promotion anymore. It was about the survival of the entire institution, and by extension, the financial ruin of the man who had just publicly humiliated me. My revenge was already operating on a level he couldn't comprehend. I wasn't here to spite him. I was here to be the only available solution to a crisis he was too blind to see. I took a deep breath, letting the moment stretch, savoring the anticipation of the shift. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a correction. The contract, then. No more delays. Ms. Reed opened the leather portfolio. Inside, on a crisp, heavy stock paper, was the document. It wasn't an employment contract. It was the acquisition agreement. As per the terms outlined in the private merger proposal, all final signatures must be secured tonight. The press release is scheduled for 9 p.m. EST, T-minus 10 minutes, Avery. The promotion my title alluded to was merely a consequence of the acquisition, the immediate appointment of the CEO of the acquired entity, me, to the Executive Vice President, Global Compliance role at Sterling. A $350 million valuation for a company I built from an apartment. The moment I signed, I wouldn't be his unemployed daughter anymore. I would be his former employer's new executive peer, holding the keys to the compliance kingdom. I had to sign this document in the glare of the public, under the very nose of the man who said I had failed. I glanced at the Winslow and Green VP, Marcus, who was now moving toward Evelyn, a predatory grin on his face. He saw me with Ms. Reed, but he assumed she was letting me know I needed to leave the private area. He was about to interrupt. "Excuse me, Evelyn," Marcus interjected, his voice dripping with condescension. "Is everything all right? I don't mean to pry, but I believe my firm's proposal—" He trailed off, looking at me with a dismissive wave. "Perhaps this isn't the best time for family matters." Ms. Reed didn't even look at him. She just held out an embossed fountain pen to me. "Avery, the final signature, please, on the last page." I smiled at Marcus. It was not a kind smile. "I was just saying goodbye, Marcus. My break is officially over." I took the pen, walked the few steps over to a nearby decorative pedestal, and signed my name, Avery Thorne, CEO, with a slow, deliberate flourish. The pen clicked shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in my ears, yet only audible to the three of us. The power shifted in that moment. The old order had just ended. Now, I just needed my father to witness his narrative crumble in the most spectacular way possible. I folded the contract and handed it back to Ms. Reed. The fireworks were about to start. The silence was broken only by the sound of glasses being set down. The applause that finally came was awkward, hesitant, a confused mix of congratulations and disbelief. My father, Richard Thorne, looked physically ill. Brendan's face was a mask of sheer panic, not for the firm, but for the sudden, impossible existence of a power structure where I was now above him. Marcus Winslow simply turned on his heel and walked straight out of the ballroom, his defeat total. My father finally spoke, his voice a dry, gravelly whisper. "Avery, why didn't you tell me? Why this pretense?" He wasn't asking for an explanation. He was searching for a defense, a way to spin this for the remaining crowd. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low, for his ears only. Evelyn Reed, the ultimate professional, had already melted back into the crowd, leaving the immediate aftermath to me. "Tell you what, Dad, that I was working 80 hours a week to build a technology you called a toy? That the problem I fixed for $350 million was the one you dismissed 3 years ago? You wouldn't have listened. You never do." But the public humiliation was only half of the story. The revenge was subtle, tactical, and layered with a complex form of protection. My father's retirement package, his golden parachute, was a highly leveraged 8-figure settlement tied to the firm's successful navigation of the pending SEC audit. If Sterling Capital had failed the audit, or been forced to accept a multi-hundred-million-dollar fine, the exact scenario Marcus Winslow was hoping for, Richard Thorne's reputation would have been ruined, and his retirement fund would have been wiped out by clawbacks and legal fees. He would have faced financial devastation. I looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the arrogant patriarch, but an old man whose entire identity was built on a crumbling facade. The truth was, my company's acquisition, my promotion to EVP, wasn't just a win for me. It was the only thing that saved him. My integrity AI systems were the only ones robust enough to fix the compliance gap before the SEC deadline. By integrating me and my systems at the executive level, the board was able to demonstrate immediate and comprehensive executive action to the regulators, essentially inoculating the firm against the most catastrophic fines. I hadn't just humiliated him, I had purchased his security. "I didn't do this for the title, Dad," I said, a rare note of raw emotion entering my voice. "I did this for the system. I did this because the gap you ignored was going to crash this firm, and when it crashed, everyone was going to lose everything. Your legacy, your money, Mom's stability, all of it. I gave you the one thing you needed, the one thing you never thought I had. Control." He stared at me, his eyes now wide with a dawning, terrible comprehension. He hadn't just dismissed his daughter. He had almost destroyed himself. The ultimate irony was suffocating. The failure he mocked had become the lifeline he desperately needed. The silence stretched between us, a new, heavy contract signed not in ink, but in shared, irreversible knowledge. He could never look at me the same way again. Not as the daughter he had to take care of, but as the indispensable executive who owned his future. And I, the daughter who had craved his approval for so long, finally had it, but only because I had forced his hand. The true vengeance was the realization that I had surpassed him not just in wealth, but in foresight, and that his survival was now a consequence of my success. I felt a profound sense of closure, but not the kind of clean break I thought I wanted. It was a messy, complex, and binding tie that recognized the depth of our connection, for better or worse. The rest of the party was a blur. The mood had irrevocably shifted. My father, unable to continue his performance, retreated to a quiet corner with my mother, who kept patting his arm with a worried expression. Brendan was nowhere to be seen, likely already making frantic, useless calls to his network. The other executives, sensing the new political landscape, approached me with a sudden, almost desperate deference. The VP from Winslow and Green, Marcus, was already gone, but his defeat lingered like a bad smell. They didn't see the daughter anymore. They saw the new power structure, the EVP who had just brought in the technology that saved their year-end bonuses. I spent the next hour shaking hands, accepting congratulations, and fielding pointed questions about Integrity AI's integration roadmap. I answered with precision and authority, using the language of high-level strategy that I had mastered in my exile. I was finally speaking my true language in the room where I had always been silenced. The The revenge wasn't the public announcement. It was the silent, internal shift in power that had been achieved. I had not sought to destroy my family, only to make them see the truth, and in doing so, I had inadvertently saved them. 2 weeks later, the press release was old news. I was sitting at a massive mahogany table in the Sterling Capital boardroom, leading my first executive meeting. Brendan, looking small and defeated, was one of the many attendees, his eyes unable to meet mine. I kept the meeting professional, dispassionate. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. My presence, my authority, and the massive weight of the $350 million acquisition spoke volumes. The power differential was clear, but instead of using it to crush him, I used it to elevate the entire compliance division, offering him a path to work under my new, rigorous systems. His failure was not his fault, but the product of an outdated, nepotistic system. My victory was to tear that system down and replace it with meritocracy. Later that afternoon, I was in my new corner office overlooking the Boston Harbor, a view that dwarfed the one from the party. The door opened and my father walked in, unannounced. He looked older, smaller. He closed the door quietly, a movement I had never seen from him before. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the city. "The SEC signed off yesterday," he murmured, his voice heavy with a weight that was no longer mine to carry. "Full clearance. Evelyn Reed told me your integration plan was comprehensive. Brilliant, actually." He turned, his eyes searching mine, stripped of his usual performance. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "I was wrong." The words he chose were far more significant. "Brendan is going to report to your new deputy EVP. I told him he needs to learn the systems from the ground up." He accepted it. It was a quiet admission of defeat, a surrender of the narrative, and a profound validation of my life's work. The structural change wasn't a sentimental hug. It was a structural change, the dismantling of the family hierarchy and the establishment of a new order based on respect and competence. I had avenged the years of dismissiveness not by destroying him, but by forcing him to recognize my true value and change the course of his favorite son's life. He would now be forced to see Brendan not as his unchallenged successor, but as an employee who needed to learn from the daughter he had called unemployed. My life had changed. I had achieved financial and professional freedom. His life had changed. He had gained security and humility. It was the best kind of ending, painful, honest, and transformative. The silence in that room was more resonant than any applause, signifying the end of the old regime. The next morning, I drove down to the South Shore to see my father at his home. It was Sunday, and I found him in the garden, a place he usually only visited to instruct the landscapers. He was actually pruning a massive rhododendron bush, something he hadn't done since I was a child. He didn't look up when I approached. He simply said, "The shears are sharp. Be careful if you use them." I stood beside him, breathing in the cold air, the smell of damp earth and crushed leaves. "I'm not using them, Dad. I came to talk about Brendan." He stopped pruning and looked at me, a question in his eyes. He expected me to fire his son, to complete the vengeance. "I need a family member on the inside I can trust completely, someone who knows the DNA of the firm," I said calmly. "I'm not going to let Brendan sink, but he can't start at the top, not with the reputation he has. I'm sending him to the London office, working under my best engineer for 2 years. 0 executive privileges, just coding and compliance integration. If he makes it, he comes back to a real role. If he doesn't, the decision is his." My father's expression was unreadable. It wasn't the easy path he'd always built for his son. It was tough love, delivered with the absolute authority of a superior executive, but tinged with the care of a sister. He nodded slowly. "That's fair. It's what he needs." He didn't thank me. He didn't need to. The silent exchange of respect was the real victory. I left the garden and drove back to Boston. My revenge had been a surgical strike aimed at the narrative, but its final outcome was a profound act of forgiveness through transformation. I didn't destroy my father or brother. I liberated them from the suffocating expectations of the Thorne legacy. My father found a quiet dignity in retirement, no longer burdened by the need to perform success. Brendan was finally forced to earn his own path, unburdened by the weight of being the golden boy. And I, Avery Thorne, had shed the role of the scorned daughter to become the leader I was meant to be, not by inheriting power, but by building it. I had proven that my true value was my independence, and that independence was the only thing that could save the family from itself. The old house, the old rules, were gone. A new, difficult, but honest life had begun for all of us. I looked down at the city, the cold glass of my office window reflecting my own image. A woman who had been called unemployed, but who now employed hundreds. I had created a new legacy, one built on systems, not sentiment. And that was a piece I wouldn't trade for anything. If you've ever had a massive, life-altering win that saved the people who tried to destroy you, tell me in the comments below. Did you feel more relief in the victory or in the act of silent forgiveness? I want to know what you think of my choice. Make sure you leave your answer below and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story where I dissect another family's epic downfall.